there's also the question of the hidden curriculum. These are the implicit and usually negative messages that certain tools will pass on to students that are not necessarily acknowledged or addressed openly. Okay, thanks very much for the opportunity to speak again. My work is with Interniche, the International Network for Humane Education, focuses primarily at higher education levels, the education and training of students of medicine, veterinary medicine, and biology, and whether in their practical classes across the disciplines, students are using animals for dissection, animals who are killed, or animal experiments, or other instrumental animal use. Or are they using alternatives, humane, innovative techniques such as models and software and so on? So that's our focus. Today I'm going to talk about dissection, the use of animals who are killed and then used for anatomy lessons, primarily. And this is something that's not only in higher education, but also something that in some countries is still widespread in secondary education. So I'm going to cover dissection as a topic, as a practice, look a little bit about the negative aspects of dissection at secondary level and then tertiary level, higher education, and then look at animal cadavers. Can they ever be ethically sourced? Is dissection ever acceptable? And if so, with what conditions? So let's talk about first about E.T. I'm sure everyone's seen the film E.T. Elliot, the hero of the film, along with E.T. himself, has I'll just go back to the photograph. Has a scene where there's the frog dissection in their secondary school is featured, and Elliot releases the frogs and says, "Back to the river, back to the forest, run, I want to save you, let's get out of here." And in fact, dissection at secondary school is really widespread still in the US. In other countries it might be banned and illegal or is not a common practice at all. Sometimes slaughterhouse material is used for dissection. But for many people, the memory of frog dissection stays with them for life. This was Jennifer Graham, who in the 80s conscientiously objected to dissection in her US secondary school and helped create a lot of change in the country, which partly led to the creation of state laws allowing students to say no and to be given alternatives. There's still plenty of problems with those legislations, but it was certainly a groundbreaking moment where this very problematic practice became state and national news. We can also, I think, talk to many people who have very negative messages about their secondary education, their biology classes, and the frog dissection that may have happened within those classes. So I was talking to someone on the bus, and someone in her 60s or 70s who said her main memory of biology was frog dissection and how disgusting it was, and it really put her off biology for life. And I spoke to someone just yesterday here who said that her mother faced frog dissection and that put her off going into studying human medicine, and did a different job. So we have to sort of ask whether these practices really are of use in terms of teaching objectives and what the broader impact is. And certainly for many people, it's a very negative experience at the time and something that may affect their choice of education and career, and keep negative memories for a very, very long time. Dissection in general has got a lot of problems. Of course, the animals are killed for purpose. They're very rarely ones that are found dead. So animals are killed. You have a lot of toxins involved, formaldehyde, which is a carcinogen. This is a major problem. And students are also expected usually to do such dissections. So there is an element of coercion. The ethical issues are not being discussed. the source of the animal, for example. Whether students have the right to object, that's often just ignored and you're expected to do it. And there's such a power inequality in terms of the power of teachers at secondary or higher education level, that students are often intimidated into this practice or are suddenly surprised they have to do it. So there's a large element of coercion here and gaps in the education in the broader sense of discussing ethical issues, of encouraging critical thinking, of being given the option to have different tools for learning biology. So a lot of problems. The broader impact is that animals are often taken from the wild. I've heard Indian teachers saying the frogs being collected in the wild are affecting the situation with the number of mosquitoes around. There's also the issue of transportation, of breeding of animals too, of keeping those animals, then of killing the animals, and then the actual use itself and the disposal, which might include incineration. So the broader impact is beyond the killing of the animal. It's got environmental aspects, it's got welfare across a number of different fields. So the impact is really quite broad. Teaching objectives really are the key thing when we're talking about animal use and alternatives in education. So really, what are the objectives of that practical class where a student might be expected to do a dissection of a purpose-killed animal? And this really is what we need to address very strongly to see what actually we're trying to achieve and how can we best do that. One big issue here is whether you're learning dissection as a practice or whether you're meant to be learning anatomy. You can learn anatomy in a number of different ways. It doesn't have to involve dissection. If you actually need dissecting skills, well, how many students are actually going to need dissecting skills? Many will not be going on into the life sciences or medicine. So the actual skills of dissection, which may be valuable and important for some people, are certainly not relevant for most students. And at secondary level, most students do not know what careers they want to go into. And as I said, they may well be put off going into the life sciences and medicine because of this dissection. So are you trying to learn anatomy and how best to learn anatomy? Or are you actually learning dissecting skills? And mostly it's not the latter, it's the former. You're learning anatomy. So how else can that be done? Relevance, as I said, is a very big issue. It's not relevant to most students. So I think we need to bear this in mind. And later on, perhaps, we can have a situation where more students are considering going into the life sciences, and then we can address the question of whether dissection is of use. We can look at some of the studies and the reviews, systematic reviews concerning studies and the pedagogical benefits or not of dissection. And this is one paper that's been published recently that we had some input into. And this really demonstrates that actually when you have a comparative study comparing students using alternatives with dissection, students learn equally or better when using alternatives. Now, excuse me, those are usually studies that compare one alternative with dissection. In reality, you may well use a number of different tools, software and models, as a replacement, and in fact, perhaps even to meet more objectives beyond your standard teaching objectives of understanding anatomy, comparative anatomy between species, and so on. So in fact, we would say that in every case, the use of alternatives will meet and exceed the teaching objectives achieved through dissecting a purpose-killed animal. There's also the question of the hidden curriculum. These are the implicit and usually negative messages that certain tools will pass on to students that are not necessarily acknowledged or addressed openly. This may be messages that say, animals can be used as objects, as tools, or that your moral position is unimportant, or that we can make big compromises now for a supposed future benefit, is also that your compassion, your empathy are not important. You should conform, not think critically. These are some of the messages that are imparted to students when a tool may be a problematic tool. So this is the hidden curriculum. When you use alternatives, you can obviate, you can remove the lessons of the hidden curriculum, these negative lessons. So overall, pedagogically, quality of education, we can see that alternatives can do a better job for standard teaching objectives, can help you meet new objectives as well, as I'll talk about in a moment, and can overcome some negative messages too. Moral development, ethics and values are also very important here. At secondary level, students are still very much developing their moral positions, thinking about ethical issues, and so we would say that it's really much too soon to be working with animals that are killed. I'll explain what I mean by what's too soon and whether higher education animal use is okay shortly, but it's really a situation where students are not familiar with many of these issues and have not thought about them. And also many issues are not discussed openly by teachers. They're just told, here's a frog, dissect it, rather than this frog was killed, and so on. So I think this is very important to bear in mind, that secondary level is really much too soon to be using animals killed for the purpose, or even so-called waste products from slaughterhouses as well. Psychologically, dissection may bring about an emotional response in students, such as withdrawal. It might encourage bad behavior in the classroom. There may be other sort of trauma events, experience because of the use of animals. So psychologically, I think we also need to look at the impact on students. This is a study looking at the psychological effects on students of using animals harmfully within their classroom, and you can read a little bit more about this, but from a psychologist who analysed the process. It can also encourage discrimination. Students who might not be keen on using animals harmfully in education may be pushed into it, as I mentioned with the coercion earlier. So this really is a form of discrimination. We've all looked at sort of veganism as a deeply held moral belief, and this is a connected area. It may be a vegan, or it may be someone else who's against the killing of animals. And so there's a discrimination aspect, an issue of accessibility as well in terms of education, whether people from different positions, moral positions, religious positions, would find something like this against their principles. But it's also a question of just doing the same thing with one tool. You know, there are many different tools, many different alternatives that can better accommodate different learning styles as well. And so it's also a question of a very limited approach within education, and whether or not there are better ways of including everyone with their different learning styles, their different positions. And so discrimination really is very much associated with harmful animal use, such as dissection. Safeguarding as well. The bad behavior I mentioned is also important. We can often find situations where there's bad behavior, and this in a way is linked to the sort of transgressive act of killing an animal. I'm all in favor of transgression when we want to break restrictive societal norms, but this is a form of transgression that involves killing and harm and discrimination. And so I think it also feeds into transgressive behavior from students. We've heard stories of students doing cat dissections and then throwing organs at each other, using the intestines as a skipping rope. Just recently I heard of a neighbour who was very young, 12, 13, who during a scouting event was given a dead pigeon and they're just suddenly told to dissect it or encouraged to dissect it. My neighbour's child actually did try and do a sort of good dissection and learn something from it, but the others were pulling off the wings of the pigeon, were stabbing the animal. It encourages very bad behaviour, and it also feeds into stereotypical behaviour in terms of the boys and the girls, with girls being shown the photographs if they don't of the dissection if they don't want to do it, or having frogs put down their clothes. People being sort of, as would be said in the US, grossed out by this. And the response often is, well, don't be squeamish. This is one of the pejorative terms used to dismiss someone's ethical concerns or their discomfort with using animals. It's not squeamishness. It may be that you as a student don't want to go on to work in zoology or medicine or veterinary medicine, and that's fine. You might not like the sight of blood or organs yet. Maybe later on, when you're older, you will. But this is really an issue where bad behaviour is often brought about or is accepted. So there are safeguarding issues in terms of children here too. Legislation, regulations. It is illegal in some countries, Argentina, Slovakia, Israel, and more. I think Liechtenstein too, to use animals harmfully in secondary education is also a typically rare practice in some other countries. And there are state laws in the US saying that many state laws saying that students shouldn't be using animals if they don't want to. So there are regulations locally as well as that legislation, and we have a policy that we've developed in detail, which I'll be looking at shortly, which also addresses this issue. These are some of the alternatives. We have the cadaver frog, a few years old now, which is a very high quality, high fidelity frog, suitable for high school dissection. It's a model. There's also software, where you can look through the body, dissolve different layers of the body in order to understand anatomy, and it really helps with visualization. And like with software, you can go back and forth. You can really revise well. It's much better than one bad experience with a killed frog in a classroom. And you can also do a virtual dissection as well as this model where you can look through the body and sort of take it apart, well, look through and then build it up again. That's also quite a good approach, but you can also have a virtual dissection. You can also go out and see animals in the wild or in the pond that you've built in your school. This also helps you see living animals. It helps you see animals within their natural and ecological context, and you can add behavior to the study too. So this is very, very valuable. So these are some of the alternatives that can be used within secondary level. The impact then, of course, goes far beyond having an ethical situation. You can also learn these extra things like seeing animals and look at their natural behavior. So you've got ecological benefits, you've got pedagogical benefits. Often you can save money economically as well. It's good for the school, and through the use of software, manage large class sizes even better as well. So there's a lot of positive benefit from using the alternatives too. Now, at higher education, the question is, should dissection ever be allowed? And if so, what would the conditions be? Now, we would say that at secondary level, no, dissection should not be allowed at all, for all the reasons I've mentioned. And also, we'd say no for medical students, human medical students. Well, why would they want to learn about frog anatomy? There's plenty of other things about humans that would be good to learn, not so sort of irrelevant or misleading, and more focused on the relevant body. Zoology, and the same with biology students going on to study ecology or botany. But zoology students, part of biology, veterinary students, now, is dissection acceptable for them? We would argue it is. It's a good approach. It's one of several good approaches, along with models and software and seeing animals in their natural habitat. Dissection can help in some ways. So we'd say it would be like one type of tool, but only under very specific conditions. And what are they? Here at first are some of the non-animal methods before we come to dissection. We have models, we have building up clay models where you're slowly creating the body and looking at the musculature and so on. These are alternatives to killing of animals. There's also 3D printing where you can make new tools, make new models. There's videos of professionally performed dissections, which are excellent for really having a better experience. Most students doing dissection will not do it well. What are they really learning? So using recordings and digitized film can often be very, very valuable and impart more learning, give more opportunities to those students. And all of these in combination really will meet and exceed standard objectives, as well as overcome the negative messages of the hidden curriculum. You have dissection software, like I mentioned. You can compare between species, get more information, look at microanatomy. You can have a range of different animals. Some great new technology now where you can fly through the bodies and identify all the different organs. You can do things as apps for tablets and phones, small animals, large animals, highly detailed photographic resources of different levels of dissection. And also this can be, and has been in this case, developed into VR, virtual reality models that are even more immersive and add more achievements. So, can dissection ever be acceptable? Our policy, I'm going to take you through two aspects of our policy, which is quite detailed, but I will summarize each key point, and that will explain where we consider, when we consider dissection is acceptable and what the conditions should be. So we have a 10-point policy. Part 4 is the policy on animal dissection. So we say that it can be a useful tool for knowledge and skills acquisition, and it may even feed into an appreciation of life as long as all these conditions are met. The first one is that the cadaver is ethically sourced. And in the next section of the policy that I'll show you, I'll explain what we mean by ethically sourced. Or from an acceptable other source. This is a tiny bit of flexibility we have for when animals can't be ethically sourced because they're not free living, for example. And that's just a tiny bit of support for situations in veterinary medicine where people need to learn about animal anatomy where they can't typically get those animal cadavers. But this is the main aim. So first, the animal needs to be ethically sourced. Secondly, it's only at university level, never below. Thirdly, that it's relevant for the student's career. Fourth, that the student's ethical position is respected. They still might not want to do it. Fifth, that the dissection is performed in the context of respect for life and respect for the cadaver, respect for that body. Sixth, that it's complemented by observation of living animals, so the focus isn't only on dead animals, wherever possible, of the same species. Next, where the instructors, the teachers, are ethically aware and responsible, have the right training, and for all of the aspects. And lastly, where ethics, including animal rights and welfare, animal use, and alternatives, as well as the human-animal bond, are also discussed openly and fully. So the broader context is fully discussed. So that's our policy when we will consider dissection to be acceptable or not, and all of those would have to be met in order for it to be considered acceptable. Then we come on to the question of what does ethically sourced mean? So let's now look at the definition of ethically sourced. That's a similar 9 or 10 point policy. So we say that the use of dissection is acceptable, the use of animal bodies is acceptable when all these conditions are met. So the first one is that the animal was not captured or bought or bred or kept or harmed or killed to provide that animal cadaver or organ or tissue. So that excludes almost all the current situation of animals being killed for dissection, because virtually all involve that. Almost all dissection is of purpose-killed animals, not of animals that died naturally, for example. Second, the animal was a free-living, wild, stray, or companion animal before death. So animals that come from research or testing, or farms, or circuses, would not be acceptable in terms of the definition. So it's a question of the life of the animal and the death of the animal. So if the animal came from a research facility, a surplus animal that was killed, that would not count as ethically sourced, because the keeping of the animal, the killing of the animal were both unnecessary, and the ethics were limited by that environment. So that would never be leading towards the definition of ethically sourced. Then there's the death itself. The animal would need to have died from natural causes or in an accident, or was humanely euthanized secondary to natural terminal disease or serious non-recoverable injury. So people use the phrase euthanized wrongly often. It's animals that are no longer wanted. They could be rehomed, for example, from a research facility. The use of the word euthanized is wrong, but also euthanasia, putting down of animals when they cannot recover, when they have got a non-recoverable injury, for example, would be acceptable. It's in the interest of the animal. It's for the animal's own benefit. It's for a medical reason. And if that, or an accident, or a natural death, was the death of the animal, that would also feed into this being acceptable. Next, the decision to euthanize was made by a qualified vet. So in other words, they need to know what they're doing and to have made a good judgment, with, of course, the consent of that companion animal guardian, that pet owner. Next, consent to be used in education was given by the animal's guardian. That the tissue was only leftover tissue and wasn't needed, and was scheduled for disposal. So that's really important as well. The body also as well, but the any sort of spare tissue was not needed. Was waste, I'm sorry. And next, that that tissue is not needed for another animal or for the species. So in other words, it wasn't crucial for another purpose, and could therefore be used ethically. Penultimately, those involved in this process of sourcing are ethically aware and responsible. So we've got to understand that the context is one of respect and being informed and doing it well. And finally, that everything is done within a broader context of respect for the cadaver, respect for the organs, and to the highest ethical and health and welfare standards. So this is very strict, but I think harm is a very serious issue. Death is an example of harm. It might be necessary to cause harm within surgery. As part of the healing process, it may be necessary to put an animal down sometimes and cause that harm, but death is still a form of harm in our opinion. So harm is usually just considered to be pain, suffering, distress, but actually it should include killing too. Occasionally that killing may be necessary. We would call it euthanasia, but it's also still killing. So those are the conditions, very strict, and they can indeed be met. We have a flow chart that we've developed about this as well, rather than a detailed policy. The flow chart is included within this published paper. We also have acceptable other sources that I mentioned earlier, but don't have time to go into. This would be where an animal, like a camel, might never be free living and is used as a work animal and a companion animal, but still the death would have to be natural or being put down for medical reasons. So the death requirement, the reason for death would be the same, but it could be an animal that wasn't quite as free living simply because those animals don't exist as free living, and the students will need to learn camel anatomy if they're graduating in Egypt or Australia. Apparently there's lots of camels in Australia. You can see those details in our policy online. There's also a question of production of alternatives like videos of dissections, and that's also an ethical issue which we don't have time to go into, but our policy reflects the same thing but also addresses the production of tools. Even if they can replace a lot of killing or experiments, still we have to question the ethical issues there in terms of the source of the animal. Here's the flow chart. It's just part of it. It's a long flow chart. You answer questions. We're going to have an online version of this at some point in the next few months, but you answer questions about the source of the animal, the death of the animal, the purpose of the use of the proposed purpose of the use of that cadaver. And then there's 3 options for the 3 results: ethically sourced, acceptable other source, or unacceptable as far as we're concerned. So there's a flow chart to make it easier. And this is the solution, one of the major solutions for how to get ethically sourced animal cadavers when it's relevant and within the right context. It's a body donation program. Now, in the Netherlands, there's a national level program for collecting animal bodies that are donated into education and a little bit of research from private clinics across the country. It started off as something close to just Utrecht, and now is a national level program linking Proof de Vrij, the animal protection group working against animal experiments nationally, with the university. So the animal rights group promotes this program at clinics across the country. Owners, guardians of animals can consider this as an option for donating the body into the education process and making good use of that body and continuing the memory as a sort of memorial to their pet in the future of better trained future veterinarians. And then those animals then are either used fresh or they're plastinated or used in other ways for education. And that has replaced the killing of animals for dissection and for some other purposes. So it's possible to have programs even at the level of a country. And it's a very successful program. There are some other programs in other countries. There are a lot of ad hoc programs as well. So you can also set up, but the more sort of formalized and formal these are, the better. So we're close to the end. I'll just do my last few slides. The animals can also be plastinated or preserved in different ways, as I mentioned. And the transition to humane education, to using alternatives, is going quite well. It has been since the beginning of useful software in the 90s. So there's a good process going on. It's important to be aware of really what you're trying to achieve, to be objective about that, and then to be committed to finding solutions, the information. And this is also a good practice for schools and universities to have better teaching. Students often say no. They may be discomfort. They might also stand up and say no more vociferously, and that is also very valuable. It can bring about a lot of change for those students. And we also offer support when those students say no to the killing of animals for dissection. But it's also really important to recognize that this also is a statement about saying yes. Yes to humane education. Yes to respecting animals. Yes to respecting your moral positions, your religious positions, and to the opportunity to harness the power of technology and better ethically informed practice within education. So I think it's very important to recognize that this isn't just saying no, it's saying no to problematic practice and saying yes to something very good, saying yes to a future where animals and nature and students are better respected. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Nick, for this very interesting presentation. So we do have a little bit of time for maybe 1 or 2 questions or comments. Does anyone have a question? Yes.
Okay, since the beginning of the presentation, I want to say I liked it a lot. It gave me a lot to think about. I wonder, why are there situations where it's kind of necessary to go into dissection if you presented all these amazing alternatives that does not involve the dilemma of using the body of an animal?
I think the main argument, and I think it's true, is that you need, if you're a veterinary student or a zoologist, it's very valuable to have hands-on experience of animals and animal tissues. So if you're going to be working as a vet, palpating an animal, working to diagnose effectively, working to give the right treatment, it's very important to have hands-on experience of animals. Now, there are models where they're sort of hands-on, but they're static, they don't move, they don't breathe. There's some great software. Virtual reality is both valuable for visualization and can have haptic technology, simulation of the sense of touch as well. So you can get some element of hands-on with some non-animal alternatives. But if you're going to be working with animals, you really need to have experience of hands-on work with the animal and looking at the different tissues, understanding the different textures, the different feels, how it responds to giving injections or palpation or other interventions, other examinations. So I think it's very important for some students. It excludes quite a lot, no secondary level, no medical students, no botany students, but for vets and zoologists, it is very important, and the hands-on aspect is the main thing there. But there are these other alternatives too. I would just say dissection is valuable for those students only within the right context and meeting all these different conditions in combination with other tools. So it should be one type of approach only. And I think if the animal is a donor animal, for example, then there's no ethical problems there. In fact, the ethics are very positive. There's a donation program and so on.
Thank you. So I do see another hand up. I'm coming over. So last question for this presentation.
Hi. Thank you for this. So this is like a guideline for the faculties and schools that want to join you, or is this like a plan to put this in law for all the faculties and schools in Europe? Because I was a veterinary school student, I'm a vet. I know how many victims there were during our education process.
Yes, and those animal victims are not only killed for dissection, but also often used alive in animal experiments or other instrumental animal use. I think there's been some really, really good progress. There are departments across the world where things are only humane, but still there's a lot to do. This presentation and this policy is about exploring the ethical and the practical issues concerning dissection, but also the use of animal cadavers in dissection and broader. Also, animal cadavers could be used for some clinical skills and surgery practice too. They can also be perfused with coloured water going through to create a sort of live surgical situation. So I think they are valuable, but mostly what we're talking about is having a policy that we would encourage people to follow. Where it can feed into regulations or law, we'd be happy for it. I know that in Serbia, harmful animal use, which covers the three areas I mentioned, including dissection of killed animals, the Article 42 within the Serbian animal protection law is a reflection of part of our policy. So actually our policy is fed into the banning of harmful animal use in education in Serbia. It's not a big country, but it's still there. So it can feed in some ways. We'd like to feed it in more. It also feeds into other things. So Brazilian resolutions have largely banned some animal experiments across the country, and now veterinary education in Brazil is much more humane than it was. Very few animal experiments, perhaps none, within surgery training, for example. Zoology dissections in India have been banned some years ago, and we played a role in that process, one of many individuals and organizations who were involved. And in India, we're talking about tens of millions of animals that were killed for zoology dissection at university level. That's now banned. So those millions, if not tens of millions of animals are no longer used. So it can be powerful. I wouldn't say that the Indian bodies were following our policy, but certainly elements of our policy fed into our campaigns and pushing to try to get change from the relevant bodies there. And the same could also be for any other sort of projects or practice where at least the policy can inform people. We can talk about what ethically sourced means. We can encourage that. Of course, we'd like to have the policy reflected in laws and regulations across the world. The reality is things change all the time. Laws are often short, paragraphs are even shorter, so it's quite tricky. But yeah, the more we can do this, the better. We're looking at other ways of popularizing these arguments within the policy, and hopefully they can also encourage the incorporation of points or paragraphs of the policy in regulations and laws in the future.
All right. Thank you, Nick, so much for your presentation.
Okay. Thank you very much.